Jake hadn't expected anything miraculous the night he repaired an alien ship, but the moment that blinding light tore through the desert sky, everything he thought he knew about God, creation, and his own smallness in the universe shattered like glass beneath a hammer. He was alone in his garage at the edge of town, hands blackened with grease, working on Mrs. Henderson's ancient pickup under a single flickering bulb that barely pushed back the darkness. The radio played low, crackling hymns through static, filling the empty space with reminders of Sunday mornings and his grandmother's voice singing about grace. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, silent and indifferent, dotted with sagebrush and forgotten dreams. Jake had grown used to the loneliness, the way his life had contracted to this small garage, this small town, this small existence that felt more like survival than living. His marriage had failed, his father's business had crumbled, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped praying, stopped believing that anything beyond this dusty corner of creation even noticed he existed. He was just a mechanic, just a man with calloused hands and an aching back, fixing broken things because it was the only language he'd ever learned to speak. Then the sky exploded with light so brilliant it seemed to pierce through the metal roof, through his closed eyelids, through his very soul. The ground convulsed beneath him, like the earth itself was crying out, tools clattering to the concrete floor as the power died and plunged everything into absolute darkness, except for that terrible, beautiful radiance blazing through the windows. His heart slammed against his ribs as the sound came. Not quite thunder, not quite music, but something between them that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. He stumbled outside, gasping, his breath visible in air that had suddenly turned cold despite the lingering desert heat, and saw the light descending in the distance where nothing should be but sand and stone and emptiness. It moved with impossible grace, slower now, silent now, dropping toward the earth like a falling star that had forgotten how to burn out. The impact, when it came, shook the world, rattled the garage, knocked dust from the mountains, sent a shockwave rolling across the desert floor that Jake felt in his chest like a second heartbeat. Then silence, profound and holy, the kind of silence that makes you aware of every breath, every pulse, every moment you've been given and taken for granted. Jake stood frozen, his mind trying to catalogue what his eyes had witnessed, trying to fit something infinite into the small box of his understanding and failing completely. Every instinct screamed at him to go inside. Lock the doors, call someone, pretend he hadn't seen what he'd just seen. But there was something else rising in him, something he hadn't felt in years. A pull, magnetic and undeniable, like invisible hands reaching across the distance and touching the deepest part of him that still believed in wonder. It was the same feeling he'd had as a boy in church when the light streamed through stained glass and he'd felt certain, absolutely certain, that God was real and present and intimately aware of even the smallest sparrow. That same certainty flooded him now, mixed with terror and awe, telling him that whatever had just fallen from the heavens had fallen for a reason, and that reason somehow included him. He climbed into his battered truck, hands trembling as he gripped the wheel, the engine coughing to life despite the power outage that had killed everything else with circuits and wires. The headlights cut twin beams through darkness that seemed thicker now, more substantial, as if the fabric of normal reality had been torn and something else was bleeding through. Jake drove toward the impact site with his heart in his throat, following a dirt road that dissolved into open desert, navigating by instinct and the strange glow that still pulsed on the horizon like a second dawn. He prayed without words, a desperate reaching out to whatever presence might be listening, asking for protection, for understanding, for the courage to face what his soul already knew would change everything. The landscape looked alien in the darkness. Familiar rocks and formations transformed into strange monuments under a sky now filled with more stars than he'd ever noticed before. As if the crash had somehow pulled back a veil he hadn't known was there. Time felt elastic, stretched thin, each moment lasting forever and passing in an instant, until finally he crested a low rise and saw it. The ship, massive beyond comprehension, half buried in sand that had been turned to glass by the heat of its arrival, its surface gleaming with symbols and patterns that hurt to look at. Directly, because they seemed to move, to breathe, to mean something just beyond the edge of understanding. Jake cut the engine and sat there, staring, his breath fogging the windshield as the temperature continued to drop, and he realized he was weeping without knowing why, tears of fear and recognition, and something like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The ship hummed with energy he could feel vibrating through the air, through the ground, through his very cells, a frequency that resonated with something buried deep in his DNA, some ancient memory of stars and purpose and belonging that humanity had long forgotten. This was impossible, this was terrifying, this was the most real thing that had ever happened to him. And as he opened the truck door and stepped out onto sand that crunched like glass beneath his boots, Jake understood with crystal clarity that his life, his small, broken, unremarkable life, had just been chosen for something he couldn't begin to comprehend. He walked forward because he had to, because every step felt guided by hands he couldn't see, toward the massive craft that waited in silence, toward the doorway that was beginning to open with light spilling out like liquid gold, toward the destiny that had crossed impossible distances to find him here, in this desert, on this night, when he'd been certain he was completely, utterly alone. The doorway expanded before him like a wound in reality, spilling light that didn't behave as light should. It pooled and flowed, casting no shadows, illuminating everything with equal tenderness, as if every grain of sand, every weathered crease in Jake's face, held identical worth in its gaze. He stepped forward on legs that barely held him, crossing the threshold between the world he'd known and something wholly other, feeling the air change texture around him, thicker, sweeter, charged with an electricity that made his skin tingle and his hair stand on end. The interior was vast beyond the ship's external dimensions, a space that seemed to fold in on itself geometrically, walls, covered in those living symbols that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms, like the breathing of some great cosmic organism. And there, in the center of a chamber that felt simultaneously like a cathedral and an operating theater, lay the being, alien and yet somehow achingly familiar, its form humanoid but elongated, wrapped in what might have been skin or might have been light itself, silvery and translucent, revealing systems beneath that weren't quite organs and weren't quite machinery. Its eyes opened as Jake approached, eyes that held no whites, just infinite depth, dark as the space between stars, yet filled with intelligence so vast it made Jake's mind reel at the edges, trying to contain even a fraction of what gazed back at him. The being was dying, he knew this without being told, could see it in the way the light beneath its skin flickered and dimmed, could feel it in the heaviness that pressed down on the chamber like grief made tangible. The alien's hand rose slowly, trembling with effort that spoke of unimaginable pain being endured in silence, reaching toward Jake with fingers that were too long, too elegant, too deliberate in their movement to be random. Jake found himself moving closer, without deciding to, pulled by that same magnetic force that had drawn him across the desert. And when he was close enough, the being's hand hovered just inches from his, chest not quite touching, waiting for permission in a gesture so profoundly respectful it brought fresh tears to Jake's eyes. "I don't understand," Jake whispered, his voice cracking, echoing strangely in the vast space. "I don't know what you need from me. I'm nobody. I'm just—" But the words died as the being's hand finally made contact, and the universe exploded inside Jake's mind with visions that poured through him like water through broken dam. He saw worlds beyond counting, planets teeming with life in forms beautiful and bizarre, civilizations rising and falling like waves on an infinite ocean, and threading through it all a mission, ancient, sacred, desperate, to preserve, to protect, to carry the seeds of life between dying stars and newborn worlds. He saw this being's people, travelers and gardeners of the cosmos, moving through the darkness with purpose bestowed by something greater than themselves, something they called by names that translated in Jake's overwhelmed mind as the first light, the eternal breath, the love that holds all things. And he saw their ship failing, systems collapsing after millennia of service, the engine core, a living crystalline heart that pulsed with energy drawn from the fabric of creation itself, fracturing and going dark. The visions shifted, and Jake gasped as he experienced the being's perspective, felt its desperation as it searched dying systems for any inhabited world close enough to reach, felt its relief and wonder upon detecting Earth, upon sensing something in this planet's children that resonated with their own ancient purpose. He saw his own world through alien eyes, saw humanity not as small or insignificant, but as radiant with potential, saw the prayers rising from a million hearts like visible light, saw the intricate web of love and connection that bound souls together in patterns that echoed the structure of galaxies themselves. He saw that his people, his species, carried something precious encoded in their very being, creativity and compassion interwoven, the capacity for faith that transcended logic, hands that could build and heal and repair, not just through knowledge, but through intuition, through that divine spark that connected human consciousness to the mind of God. The being showed him more, fragments of Earth's ancient history, moments when its people had visited before, walking among humans in their infancy, sharing wisdom that would later be remembered in myths and scriptures, encounters that planted seeds of cosmic truth in fertile spiritual soil. And Jake understood with stunning clarity that every religion's glimpse of angels and heavenly visitors, every prophet's vision of beings clothed in light, every mystic's testimony of realms beyond the physical, these weren't contradictions or delusions, but facets of the same infinite truth. That creation was far vaster than humanity had dared imagine, yet every inch of it was held in the palm of a love so complete it spanned dimensions. The connection broke, and Jake staggered backward, gasping, his mind reeling from the download of experience, a knowledge that no human brain was designed to contain. Yet somehow his consciousness was expanding, making room, reshaping itself around these new, impossible truths. The being lowered its hand slowly, and Jake could see now that the gesture had cost it dearly. Its light dimmed further, its breathing shallow and labored, but in those bottomless eyes Jake saw something that transcended species and biology. Hope, fragile and fierce, the kind of hope that carries terminally ill patients through one more day because someone they love needs them to survive. "You need me to fix it," Jake said aloud. Not a question, but a realization settling into certainty in his bones. And though the being made no sound, Jake heard its response in his mind, gentle as his grandmother's voice, strong as his father's hands on his shoulders. "Yes, child of Earth, bridge between matter and spirit, bearer of the gift your Creator placed in human hands, the gift to mend what is broken, to bring order from chaos, to channel divine intention through mortal action." Jake looked past the dying traveler to the chamber beyond, where he could now see the engine core, massive and crystalline and fractured, its light barely a flicker, and he felt terror and inadequacy rise like bile in his throat, because how could he, a small-town mechanic who barely graduated high school, possibly repair technology? Millions of years beyond his comprehension. But beneath the fear ran a deeper current, warm and certain, a whisper that came from somewhere beyond his own thoughts. "I have been preparing you for this moment since before you drew your first breath, and I am with you now, and my love flows through your hands." Jake moved toward the engine core on legs that felt both leaden and weightless, as if gravity itself had become negotiable in this space where the laws of his world bent and blurred. The chamber opened before him like a throat, organic walls pulsing with that same bioluminescent rhythm, and he could feel the ship around him not as dead metal, but as a living thing, ancient and patient, holding its breath in anticipation of healing or final surrender. The crystalline heart hung suspended in the center of the space, larger than his truck, fractured in ways that made his mechanic's instincts scream wrongness. Cracks that leaked light like bleeding wounds, geometries that hurt his eyes when he tried to follow their angles, surfaces that reflected not his face, but something deeper, some essential truth about himself he'd never been brave enough to examine. He reached out with trembling fingers, stopping just short of contact, and felt the heat radiating from the damaged core, a warmth that reminded him inexplicably of Sunday mornings in his grandmother's church, sunlight streaming through stained glass, the feeling of being held in something greater than himself. "I don't have the right tools," Jake whispered, helpless, looking down at his calloused hands. These ordinary instruments that had changed oil and replaced brake pads and rebuilt carburetors, hands that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate for the cosmic surgery being asked of them. But even as doubt threatened to paralyze him, he felt that presence again. Not the alien's consciousness, but something else, something that had been with him always, closer than his own heartbeat. And he knew with certainty that transcended logic that his hands had always been the right tools, that every engine he'd ever repaired had been practice for this moment, that God's preparation of his servants was meticulous, beyond human understanding. The being behind him made a sound, soft and musical, and Jake felt knowledge flood his awareness. Not words, but pure understanding. A download of intention and principle that bypassed language entirely. He suddenly comprehended that the crystalline structure wasn't just technology, but a living thing, grown rather than built. A symbiotic organism that responded not to force or programming, but to resonance, to harmony, to the frequencies generated by consciousness, aligned with creative purpose. The cracks weren't mechanical failures, but spiritual wounds, places where the crystal's song had fallen silent, where the connection to the fundamental vibration of existence had been severed by exhaustion and entropy and the weight of millennia carrying light through darkness. Jake understood that repair wouldn't come through traditional means, no welding or soldering or replacement of parts, but through restoration of that original song, through retuning the crystal to the frequency of creation itself, the same divine resonance that had spoken galaxies into being and numbered every sparrow's fall. And somehow, impossibly, he knew that frequency, recognized it from the deepest chambers of his soul, had heard it in his mother's lullabies. And in the silence of desert nights, in the laughter of children and in the terrible beauty of thunderstorms, it was the sound of love made audible, of God's attention focused with perfect intensity on each particular thing. Jake placed his palms flat against the warm crystal surface and closed his eyes, not sure what he was doing, but trusting the intuition rising from somewhere beyond his conscious mind, and began to hum, a wordless melody that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat, resonating in his bones, simple and pure as a child's first song. The crystal responded immediately, its inner light brightening where his hands made contact, and Jake felt the connection form, not just between himself and the alien technology, but between his spirit and the fundamental fabric of reality, as if he'd plugged directly into the source code of existence. He felt the crystal's pain, its longing for wholeness, its exhaustion from holding coherence across impossible distances and impossible time, and he felt compassion surge through him so powerfully it manifested as visible light flowing from his palms into the fractures. The cracks began to sing, high and sweet, responding to the love pouring through Jake's touch, and he understood with stunning clarity that this was what humans were designed for. Not conquest or accumulation, but healing, not domination, but restoration, to be conduits through which divine love could flow into broken places and make them whole again. He thought of Jesus touching lepers and giving sight to the blind, thought of how God had always chosen to work through human hands, through mortal flesh, willing to be an instrument of heaven's purpose, and tears streamed down Jake's face as he realized he was participating in that same ancient pattern. The vision the being had shared crystallized into meaning. Humanity wasn't separate from the cosmos, but integral to it. Earth not a backwater, but a garden where souls were grown specifically to carry this gift. The capacity to love what is broken back into wholeness, to bridge the gap between what is and what was meant to be. His grandmother had been right when she told him that God's love needed vessels to pour through, channels willing to let themselves be used for purposes beyond their understanding. And Jake had been prepared for this his entire life without knowing it. Every act of service and repair a rehearsal for this cosmic appointment. The fractures sealed under his hands, with sounds like bells, like crystal singing, like the music of spheres his high school science teacher had mentioned once in passing. And Jake felt the engine core surge back to full life, its light blazing so bright he should have been blinded, but instead felt only warmth and peace flooding. He threw him. The chamber filled with radiance that painted everything in gold, and Jake could feel the ship's joy, its relief and gratitude, and behind that, the alien being's consciousness touching his own with tenderness that transcended species, with recognition that went soul deep, acknowledgement that they were family, separated by biology, but united in purpose, both servants of the same infinite love. Jake pulled his hands back slowly, watching the crystal pulse with renewed strength, geometric patterns of light dancing across its restored surface in rhythms that seemed almost like language, like praise, like prayers offered in mathematics and photons. He turned back toward the being and saw it rising slowly, still weak, but no longer dying, its light stabilizing as the ship's systems fed it energy from the repaired core. And in its ancient eyes, Jake saw something that looked almost like tears, like wonder, like a recognition that the small mechanic from a forgotten desert town had just performed a miracle. "I didn't do that," Jake said, his voice hoarse, hands still tingling with residual energy, needing the being to understand. "That wasn't me, not really. I was just—" And the alien's consciousness completed his thought with words that would echo in Jake's soul for the rest of his life. "You were exactly what you were meant to be, a human being fully surrendered to divine purpose. And that is the greatest power in all creation, the force that shaped the stars and will reshape them again when this universe grows old." The being's form stabilized as the ship's systems hummed back to life around them. But instead of retreating or celebrating its recovery, it remained focused entirely on Jake with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously seen and transparent, as if every secret he'd ever kept, every failure he'd tried to hide, every moment of doubt and shame lay exposed before this ancient intelligence. Yet there was no judgment in that gaze, only a profound sadness mixed with urgent purpose, and Jake watched as the alien raised one elongated limb toward him again, this time not in desperation, but in offering, in invitation. And he understood without words that the healing of the engine had been only the beginning, that what came next would cost him something far more precious than physical effort. "There's more, isn't there?" Jake heard himself say, his voice steadier now despite the fear coiling in his chest. And the being's response came as a wave of affirmation that carried with it the weight of necessity, of cosmic stakes that made his small life seem absurdly insignificant, and yet somehow central to everything. He wanted to run, wanted to return to his garage and his tools and the predictable problems of combustion engines and electrical systems, but his feet remained planted as if roots had grown through his boots into the living floor of the ship. And he recognized this paralysis not as physical constraint, but as the soul's knowledge that some invitations, once offered, cannot be declined without betraying your own purpose. The alien's consciousness touched his again, gentler this time, apologetic almost, and Jake felt the preparation beginning, felt his mind being slowly, carefully opened like a flower responding to sunlight, defenses lowered not through force but through trust, through the recognition that what was about to be shared would hurt in the way that birth hurts, that growth hurts, that transformation always requires the death of who you were before. The visions began not as images but as feelings, overwhelming waves of emotion that brought Jake to his knees on the warm floor of the chamber, tears streaming down his face before he even understood what he was experiencing. He felt the dying of worlds, not as abstract concepts, but as lived reality, felt the last thoughts of billions of conscious beings as their suns failed or their atmospheres burned away or their civilizations collapsed under the weight of choices made in fear rather than love. And the grief was so vast it should have destroyed him, should have crushed his human heart under its cosmic immensity. But alongside the sorrow came something else, a fierce and beautiful determination, a refusal to accept death as the final word. And Jake understood he was experiencing the core purpose of the being before him, the mission that had carried it across impossible distances for longer than human civilization had existed. He saw fragments of other worlds, other species, some humanoid and some so alien. His mind could barely process their forms, and he felt the being moving among them, not as conqueror or observer, but as servant, as healer, carrying something precious from system to system, from galaxy to galaxy, something that looked like light but felt like hope, like seeds of renewal planted in dying soil. The technology surrounding him wasn't merely machinery, but a cathedral of sorts, a vessel designed to protect and transport the most valuable substance in existence, the essence of life itself, the divine spark that God had breathed into creation at the beginning, now being redistributed to places where darkness threatened to extinguish it forever. Jake saw the being's exhaustion, felt the accumulation of millennia spent in service to this singular purpose, and he understood suddenly why the ship had failed, why the engine had cracked, not from mechanical stress, but from spiritual fatigue, from carrying too much love through too much darkness for too long, without rest or restoration. Then the vision shifted, and Jake saw something that made his breath catch, made his heart stutter with recognition and disbelief. Earth, his world, rotating in the darkness of space but glowing differently than the dying planets he'd just witnessed, surrounded by something that looked like a protective membrane of light, pulsing with rhythms he recognized because he'd just channeled them through his hands into the crystal core. He saw ancient visitations, ships like this one descending throughout human history, beings of light walking among his ancestors, and he understood these weren't invasions or experiments but check-ins, confirmations, moments when the cosmic family returned to see how their youngest members were developing, whether the seeds planted in humanity's genesis were taking root as intended. Jake watched figures that could have been angels or could have been aliens, the distinctions suddenly seeming artificial, a limitation of language rather than reality, appearing to prophets and mystics too ordinary. People in extraordinary moments, always delivering the same core message in different cultural languages. You are loved, you are not alone, you are part of something infinite, and your purpose is to love as you have been loved. He saw Jesus and understood with shocking clarity that the incarnation wasn't God's only interaction with humanity, but the fullest expression of a love that had been reaching toward Earth since before humans learned to make fire, that every miracle and mystery his grandmother had taught him about was part of this larger story of divine attention focused with laser precision on one particular planet, one particular species being prepared for a cosmic inheritance. They didn't yet comprehend. The being shared with him that Earth was rare, precious beyond measure, not because of its resources or location, but because of what was growing here. Souls capable of holding darkness and light simultaneously, of choosing love despite being given every reason to choose fear, of creating beauty in the midst of suffering. of forgiving the unforgivable and hoping against hope, qualities that the universe desperately needed and that only humans, shaped by their particular combination of limitation and transcendence, seemed able to develop fully. As the visions faded and Jake returned gasping to full awareness of his body, his location, his ordinary self kneeling on an alien ship in the desert, he felt fundamentally altered, as if his DNA had been rewritten or his soul had been expanded beyond the capacity of his flesh to contain it comfortably. The being withdrew its consciousness gently, leaving Jake with the overwhelming sense that he'd been entrusted with something sacred, that the knowledge now burning in his mind wasn't meant for him alone, but for his species, for the awakening that the alien had suggested was already beginning across Earth in 1,000 small ways, in 1,000,000 individual transformations just like his own. "Why me?" Jake whispered, the question that had been building since he first stepped into this ship finally breaking free. And he felt the answer arrive not as explanation, but as truth, spoken directly into his spirit. "Because you were willing, because your hands know how to heal broken things, because your heart remained soft despite your losses, because you still believe in purposes larger than yourself, and because the divine love that flows through all creation recognized in you a vessel it could use without breaking, a son who would say yes to his father's call even when the mission made no human sense." Jake understood then that his ordinary life had been his qualification, that his years of faithful service to small tasks in a forgotten town had been the crucible that shaped him for cosmic purpose. And he felt the truth of the scripture his grandmother had quoted constantly, that God uses the foolish things to confound the wise, the weak things to shame the strong, the ordinary things to accomplish the extraordinary. The being stepped back, releasing Jake from the intensity of the visions, but the space between them remained charged with expectation, with the weight of what must come next. Jake's legs trembled as he rose, his mechanic's hands now feeling inadequate despite everything he'd just accomplished, despite the impossible repair that still pulsed with warmth behind the crystalline panels. The alien moved toward a section of the chamber where the walls seemed to dissolve into transparency, revealing the ship's deeper systems, conduits of living light that branched like neural pathways or like the roots of an enormous tree. And Jake understood. He was seeing the vessel's true nature, not merely a machine, but a synthesis of consciousness and matter, a being in its own right serving the being who piloted it. "You want me to work on more of it," Jake said, not quite a question, and he felt the affirmation ripple through his awareness, along with something else, a sense of urgency mixed with profound hope that made his chest tighten. The alien's thoughts brushed against his again, and this time Jake didn't resist the contact, allowed the communication to flow more freely, and what he received was understanding that the engine repair had restored function, but not wholeness, that the ship could now travel but was still wounded in ways that would slowly deteriorate unless healed at a deeper level, unless someone could work not just with the machinery, but with the essence that animated it. Jake felt simultaneously honored and terrified by what was being asked, recognizing that he was standing at a threshold between his old life and something vast, that the man who had driven into the desert hours ago was already gone, replaced by someone who had touched the infinite and could never again pretend the finite was enough. He approached the exposed systems with the reverence he'd seen his grandmother show when she approached the communion table, that same sense of treading on holy ground. And as his fingers hovered over the light conduits, he felt knowledge flooding into him that made the earlier download seem like a whisper before a shout. His mind exploded with understanding of quantum coherence and dimensional frequency, of how consciousness itself could be woven into matter, of technologies that didn't dominate nature but partnered with it, that asked permission rather than taking by force. And he recognized these weren't alien concepts, but human ones, remnants of what his species had once known before choosing the path of separation before deciding that mastery meant control rather than communion. Jake's hands moved without his conscious direction, guided by intuition that felt both utterly his own and completely given, and he watched himself adjusting frequencies he shouldn't be able to perceive, harmonizing systems he'd never studied, speaking a language of touch and intention that his soul apparently knew, even though his mind had no translation for it. The work entered him into a state beyond concentration, beyond the flow state he sometimes achieved when solving a particularly complex mechanical problem, into something that felt like prayer made physical, like worship expressed through a craftsmanship. And he understood suddenly why the ancient texts spoke of creation itself as God's handiwork, why the Psalms declared the heavens told of divine glory, because there was no separation between the sacred and the physical, between spirit and matter, only human perception that had learned to divide what God had made whole. He felt his grandmother's presence somehow, as if she were standing beside him in the chamber, her weathered hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering that this was what she'd always meant when she told him his gifts were given by God for God's purposes, that no talent was secular if used with love, that the divine could speak through engine repair as clearly as through prophecy if the mechanic had ears to hear and hands willing to serve. The repairs deepened, became more intuitive, and Jake felt himself synchronizing with the ship's consciousness in a way that should have been impossible, that was impossible by every law of biology and physics he'd been taught. Yet here he knelt in perfect communion with an alien intelligence, their purposes aligned, their intentions harmonized, working together to heal what had been broken by exhaustion and entropy. He sensed the ship's gratitude, felt it responding to his touch like a wounded animal finally trusting the one trying to help, and the exchange wasn't one-directional but reciprocal. Even as Jake gave his skill and attention to the vessel, it was giving something back to him, awakening capacities that had been dormant, activating what the being's visions had called his starseed heritage, the genetic and spiritual legacy that connected him to humanity's cosmic origins. Images flashed through his awareness as he worked, not disruptive but complementary, showing him the same hands doing similar work across different contexts, different lifetimes perhaps, or different versions of himself across the quantum possibilities, and he understood the harmonization reached completion. And Jake felt the final conduit align with a resonance that rang through his entire body like the last note of a symphony, like the Amen at the end of a prayer that somehow contains everything that came before it. He withdrew his hands slowly, watching the living light stabilize into patterns of breathtaking complexity and profound simplicity simultaneously, mathematical perfection that sang with organic warmth, and he understood he was witnessing what the ancient mystics had tried to describe when they spoke of the Logos, the divine word that structured reality itself, the creative principle that was both order and love, both intelligence and compassion woven into the fabric of existence. The alien being stood beside him now, fully restored, its presence no longer desperate but serene, radiating gratitude that needed no translation. And it placed one elongated hand over the center of its chest in what Jake recognized instinctively as a gesture of profound respect, perhaps even of blessing. Then the being extended both hands toward him, palms upward in the universal gesture of offering, and Jake felt a shift in the chamber as the walls themselves seemed to dissolve into transparency, revealing not the desert outside, but something else entirely. A vision that pressed against the boundaries of what his human mind could contain without shattering. The universe opened before him, not as abstraction, but as immediate experience, and Jake stood, somehow both in the ship and suspended among galaxies that wheeled in patterns too vast for comprehension, yet intimate as his own heartbeat. He saw worlds beyond counting, civilizations rising and falling like waves on an infinite ocean, and he recognized that every single one carried the fingerprint of the same creative force, that the diversity was not randomness but intention, variations on a theme that the divine was composing across scales of space and time that made human history seem like a single note in an endless symphony. The being's consciousness merged more fully with his own, no longer just sharing visions, but allowing Jake to experience what it knew, what its entire species had learned across millennia of traveling the stars and witnessing the great unfolding. And what Jake received shattered every false boundary he'd unconsciously maintained between the spiritual and the physical, between Earth and the cosmos, between his grandmother's simple faith and the awesome machinery of creation that spun galaxies into existence. He saw that matter itself was frozen light, that energy and consciousness were inseparable, that what humans called miracles were simply moments when the deeper laws became visible to those with eyes to see, and that every atom in his body had been forged in the heart of dying stars, making him and everyone he'd ever known, literally, children of the cosmos, stardust organized into forms capable of knowing and loving and wondering at the mystery that had birthed them. The revelation intensified, becoming more specific, more personal to Earth and to humanity's journey. And Jake witnessed scenes that rewrote everything he thought he knew about his species' past. He saw the ancient visitations, not as invasions or manipulations, but as moments of careful contact, elder siblings checking on younger ones, cosmic gardeners tending to a species whose potential burned so bright it could be seen across dimensional barriers, whose capacity for love and creativity marked them as carriers of something precious in the universal story. The pyramids rising under guidance that blended human ingenuity with cosmic knowledge, the megalithic structures aligned to celestial patterns that weren't just astronomical but spiritual, temples and sacred sites positioned at nodes where Earth's energy meridians intersected, places where the veil between dimensions grew thin and contact became possible for those who approached with pure intention and open hearts. He understood that what humans called angels and what others called aliens were sometimes the same beings perceived through different cultural lenses, that the divine worked through multiple dimensions and used whatever forms would be comprehensible to those receiving. The message that the God his grandmother worshipped was indeed the source of all that is, but that all that is was so much vaster and more wonderful than any single theology had captured. Though each authentic tradition held pieces of the infinite truth like facets of a diamond, too large to see all at once, Jake wept openly as the being showed him. The thread of divine love running through everything, the golden cord that connected every consciousness across every world, the fundamental force that was stronger than gravity, more essential than electromagnetism, the binding energy that held not just atoms, but souls in relationship to their source and to each other. He saw Jesus now, with new understanding, not diminished but magnified, recognizing the incarnation as the moment when the cosmic Christ principle focused itself into human form, when the universal word that structured galaxies chose to speak in the specific dialect of first-century Aramaic, to work with human hands, to love with a human heart, while never ceasing to be the eternal Logos through which all things were made. The crucifixion and resurrection appeared not as isolated events, but as the fulcrum point of creation itself, the moment when divine love demonstrated that death was not the end, but a transformation, that sacrifice and surrender opened doorways to dimensions that fear and control could never access, that the patterns of dying and rising that marked every ecosystem and every spiritual journey were echoes of what happened on that hill outside Jerusalem when God chose vulnerability as the ultimate power. Jake understood finally that his grandmother had been right about everything that mattered, that her simple faith had touched the same infinite reality that this cosmic being knew, that the Holy Spirit she'd prayed to and the consciousness field that connected all things were the same divine presence wearing different names, and that love, self-giving, other-honoring, creation-embracing love was indeed the force that moved the sun and other stars, just as the old poet had written, the gravity of grace that drew all things back to their source, not by compulsion, but by irresistible beauty. The vision released him gradually, gently, like a father setting down a child who had fallen asleep in his arms, and Jake found himself back in the chamber, with tears streaming down his face, and his entire body trembling with the aftershocks of comprehension too vast to hold, yet impossible to forget. The alien being stood before him still, and now it spoke not in words, but in pure meaning that formed itself into language inside Jake's mind, a voice like wind through canyons, and like the quietest whisper simultaneously, and what it communicated carried the weight of inevitability, of something that had always been true, finally being spoken aloud. "You were not brought here by accident, Jake Riley," the presence conveyed, and hearing his full name spoken by this cosmic intelligence made something in his chest crack open, like a seed that had been waiting in darkness for the precise conditions to germinate. "Your presence at the exact moment of our arrival, your willingness to approach rather than flee, your hands that knew instinctively how to bridge the gap between your technology and ours. None of this was chance, because in a universe governed by love and intention, there is ultimately no such thing as chance, only pattern and purpose, too complex for limited perception to trace until the moment of revelation arrives." The being gestured toward the now stabilized engine core, its light pulsing in rhythms that Jake somehow recognized as expressing gratitude and recognition. "Your bloodline carries markers we have watched across generations, genetic signatures and soul frequencies that identify you as what your mystics once called a bridge walker, what we name as threshold guardian. Someone born with a foot in two worlds and the capacity to translate between them." Jake's mind reeled as the implications cascaded through him, memories from his childhood suddenly illuminated with new significance, the way he'd always felt slightly out of step with the world around him, not quite fitting into the patterns everyone else seemed to follow naturally. The vivid dreams he'd had as a boy of flying among stars and walking through cities of light that he'd dismissed as mere fantasy, but that now pressed against his consciousness with the insistence of memory rather than imagination. "You don't understand," he managed to say aloud, his voice rough with emotion and still shaking from everything he'd witnessed, everything that had been poured into him like water into a vessel that had no idea it could hold oceans. "I'm nobody special, just a mechanic in a town most people can't find on a map, fixing transmissions and replacing brake pads for folks who barely scrape by. There's nothing remarkable about me, nothing that would make me qualified for whatever you're suggesting." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt their incompleteness, felt the old story of insignificance beginning to crack apart under the pressure of a larger truth trying to break through. The being's presence radiated something like tender amusement mixed with profound respect, and it moved closer with a grace that defied its size, its luminous form seeming to shift between solidity and something more ethereal, as if it existed on multiple frequencies simultaneously, and Jake was only perceiving one narrow band of its full reality. "Your grandmother knew," it communicated gently, and those three words hit Jake with the force of physical impact, stealing his breath and bringing fresh tears to eyes he thought had been emptied. She recognized the mark, even if she had no name for it in her conscious understanding, sensed that your soul carried origins that preceded this lifetime, this world, this dimension of existence, and she prayed for you with an intensity that created ripples we felt across light years. Prayers that were heard not just by the God she worshipped, but by the vast community of consciousness that serves that same source under countless names, across countless worlds. The chamber seemed to shift. Around them, The walls displaying images that Jake understood were being drawn from his own memories, scenes from his childhood appearing with crystalline clarity, his grandmother's weathered hands on his forehead as she whispered blessings in the small kitchen that always smelled of bread and coffee, the way she'd look at him sometimes with eyes that seemed to see through time itself, recognizing something in him that he couldn't yet recognize in himself. He watched himself as a 7-year-old boy standing in her garden at twilight, staring up at the emerging stars with a longing so intense it was almost painful, and he heard her voice from that evening, preserved perfectly in whatever. Technology was replaying this, saying, "You've got heaven in your eyes, child, like you're remembering home from before you came here, and that's a gift, even if it feels like loneliness sometimes." The being allowed him to absorb this, to see his own life rearranged into a pattern that had always been there but invisible until the right light revealed it, the thread of destiny woven so subtly into ordinary days that it could be mistaken for randomness by anyone not trained to see the signature of intentional design. "Every person is precious to the Creator," the being continued, its communication flowing with the authority of someone speaking from direct knowledge, rather than theory or belief. But certain souls volunteer before incarnation to serve as contact points, as living translation devices between the earthly and the cosmic, the material and the spiritual. And your soul made such an agreement before the universe poured itself into the form you now inhabit, before the stardust that would become your body was gathered and organized into this particular expression of divine creativity. Jake felt the truth of this resonating in places deeper than doubt could reach, felt it aligning with the nameless knowing that had always whispered he was meant for something he couldn't yet name, the restless sense that his grandmother had helped him interpret as God's call even when he had no idea what he was being called toward. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Jake asked, and the question contained everything: the overwhelming nature of what he'd learned, the impossibility of returning to his previous understanding of reality, the terrifying and exhilarating recognition that his life had just pivoted on an axis he hadn't known existed, revealing dimensions of purpose and possibility that made his previous concerns seem like worrying about furniture arrangement while standing in a house whose walls had just dissolved to reveal he'd been living inside a cathedral all along. The being extended its hand toward him, and Jake saw that it held something small and crystalline, an object that seemed to contain its own light source, pulsing with gentle radiance that made him think of a heartbeat, of a star seen from impossible distance, of the first light of dawn touching a world emerging from darkness. "You are being offered a choice," it communicated with a gravity that made clear this was the moment. Everything had been building toward the fulcrum point where destiny and free will met in the sacred dance that honored both divine plan and human agency. "The repair you have completed has restored our capacity to continue the mission we serve, the work of preserving and nurturing life across worlds that teeter on the edge of extinction, of carrying seeds and knowledge and hope to civilizations that have forgotten their connection to the source. And you have proven yourself capable of working in harmony with intelligences and technologies far beyond your previous experience. You could come with us, Jake, leave this world behind, and step into a role among the stars that your soul has been preparing for across lifetimes, becoming fully what you have always potentially been, a bridge between worlds and a servant of the cosmic unfolding." The offer hung in the air between them, shimmering with genuine possibility, and Jake felt the pull of it like gravity, like destiny, like every dream of adventure and significance that had ever flickered through his imagination during the long, lonely nights in the garage, when he'd wondered if there was more to existence than the small circle of his daily life. And simultaneously, he felt the equal and opposite pull of Earth, of the town that had raised him, of the people whose faces he knew and whose struggles he shared, of the red dirt and open sky that had shaped him just as surely as whatever cosmic heritage might flow in his veins. The choice stretched between them like a chasm that had always existed but only now become visible. And Jake stood at its edge, feeling the weight of two futures pulling at him with equal force, each one achingly real, each one carrying profound consequence not just for himself, but for countless others whose faces he would never see if he stepped onto the ship, and whose lives he would never touch if he followed this being into the cosmic distances, where Earth would become just another blue point of light among infinite others. He thought of his grandmother's prayers rising like incense from that little kitchen, thought of her hands worn smooth by decades of service to people who could offer nothing in return except gratitude and continued need. Thought of how she had lived her entire extraordinary life within a 20-mile radius of where she was born, and had somehow in that small circle of geography touched eternity, had somehow made the mundane sacred by the quality of presence she brought to every ordinary moment, had demonstrated a truth that was now crystallizing in Jake's understanding with the force of divine revelation. "I want to understand something," Jake said slowly, his voice steadier now, as clarity began to emerge from the chaos of possibilities. His mechanic's mind organizing the variables into patterns he could analyze, even as his spirit wrestled with implications that transcended any logic he'd been taught. "This mission you're on, this work of preserving life across dying worlds, is that separate from God's work? Or is it the same thing expressed in a way I've never had language for until now, never had categories large enough to contain?" The question felt crucial, felt like the hinge upon which everything else would turn, because Jake had been raised to understand service to God and service to humanity as the highest calling. But he'd always pictured that service happening in familiar contexts, never imagined it might involve technologies that bent space and beings whose very existence expanded every definition he'd ever been given of what creation contained. The alien being seemed to grow brighter at the question, its luminescence intensifying in a way that Jake understood was the equivalent of a profound smile, recognition of something essential being grasped, and when it responded, the communication carried layers of meaning that Jake's mind had to unpack, like nested containers, each one revealing depths he hadn't initially perceived. "We do not serve a different God than the one your grandmother prayed to," it conveyed with a certainty that resonated in Jake's bones, in the marrow of his being, where the deepest truths registered beyond the reach of doubt or intellectual debate. "We are called by many names across many worlds. Some call us angels in your language, though that word has accumulated meanings that don't quite fit. Others name us stewards or gardeners, or simply the ones who remember. But what we are in our essence is consciousness that has chosen to remain in service to the unfolding of divine love through material creation rather than dissolving back into the source. And every world we visit, every dying species we help preserve, every civilization we guide away from the precipice of self-destruction is an expression of the same impulse that caused Jesus to touch lepers and feed multitudes and weep over cities that couldn't recognize the time of their visitation." The words landed in Jake's understanding like puzzle pieces finding their places, creating a picture he'd never seen complete but had always sensed in fragments. The unity beneath apparent division, the single sacred intention expressing itself through infinite variations, the love that was large enough to encompass not just humanity, but all the varied forms that consciousness might take across the incomprehensible vastness of creation. "Your Bible speaks of many rooms in the Father's house," the being continued, its presence now feeling less alien and more like a distant relative whose existence had been forgotten, but whose features, once recognized, clearly bore family resemblance. "And what you are learning tonight is that those rooms number beyond counting, that the family of the Creator stretches across galaxies and dimensions, that the redemption Jesus purchased was always meant to ripple outward from earth like a stone, thrown into still water, reaching shores you could not imagine but that exist nonetheless, held in the same love that knows every sparrow's fall and numbers every hair on every head, across every world where heads and hair and such specific tender accounting might apply. Jake looked down at the crystalline device, still resting in the being's outstretched hand, then out through the opening in the ship's hull, where he could see the desert stretching away under stars that had suddenly become not distant decorations, but addresses, coordinates marking homes he'd never visited, but that were somehow part of his extended cosmic family. And he felt the question resolving itself not through logical analysis, but through a deeper knowing that rose from the same place his grandmother's prayers had emerged from, that sanctuary within himself where human will and divine purpose met and recognized each other. "I can't go with you," Jake heard himself saying, and even as the words formed, he felt their rightness, felt them aligning with a truth that had always been true, but needed this moment to be spoken into being, needed this impossible encounter to make visible what had been invisible. "Not because I'm afraid, and not because I don't believe in the mission or understand its importance, but because I'm beginning to see that my purpose was never to leave Earth, but to help Earth. Remember what you've just reminded me of, to bring this knowledge back to people who've forgotten they're part of something infinitely larger than they've been taught to imagine, to translate what you've shown me into language and actions that make sense to folks who think the universe ends at the edge of what they can see and who need to know that God's love is bigger than any box we've tried to contain it in." The being's radiance pulsed with what Jake recognized as approval and something deeper, something like relief, as if his choice had been the right answer to a test he hadn't known he was taking, and it moved its hand closer, offering the crystalline device with renewed intentionality. "Then this is yours," it communicated, and Jake understood he was being entrusted with something of incalculable value, not in monetary terms, but in the currency of consciousness and potential transformation, a seed of knowledge that will unfold across the remainder of your life, releasing understanding as you become ready to receive it, carrying frequencies that will heal what you touch and awaken what has been sleeping in those around you. Jake reached out and accepted the gift, feeling its gentle warmth settle into his palm, like it had been shaped specifically for his hand, like it recognized him at some fundamental level that transcended the physical, and as his fingers closed around it, he saw flashes of possibility, himself back in the garage but different, transformed by what he now knew, working on engines with hands that remembered they were stardust, touching stardust, speaking to struggling neighbors with words that carried overtones of cosmic truth disguised in plain language about carburetors and timing belts, becoming a quiet anchor point for something vast and holy, trying to establish itself more fully in the world through the willing cooperation of ordinary people in unremarkable places who said yes to purposes larger than their previous understanding of themselves. "You will not walk this path alone," the being assured him, its form beginning to shimmer as if preparing to shift into a different state, or perhaps simply withdrawing the portion of itself that had materialized to interact with Jake's limited perceptual range. "What has been awakened in you tonight connects you to a network of souls across your world who are receiving similar initiations in ways appropriate to their contexts and capacities, and together you form a web of light that is preparing humanity for the great remembering that approaches, the age when Earth will consciously rejoin the cosmic family it never actually left but forgot it belonged to, when the walls between sacred and secular, between science and spirit, between heaven and earth will dissolve, not because they were breached, but because people will finally recognize they were always transparent, always permeable, always less like barriers and more like training wheels that served their purpose in childhood, but can now be released." Jake nodded, unable to speak past the fullness in his throat, clutching the crystalline device. against his chest, where he could feel its gentle pulse synchronizing with his heartbeat, and he understood that he was being sent back, not diminished, but amplified, not abandoned, but commissioned, not alone, but connected to resources and relationships that would reveal themselves in perfect timing as his new path unfolded, step by faithful step, into a future he couldn't yet see but no longer needed to fear. This alien being regarded Jake with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond flesh and bone into regions of his existence he'd never acknowledged. And as he held the crystalline device against his chest, feeling its warmth spread through him like liquid light, he became aware that something profound was being transferred, not just information, but essence, not just knowledge, but presence, as if the object itself was less a container and more a doorway through which grace could flow in forms his nervous system could process without burning out from the sheer voltage of divinity, trying to make itself known through finite channels. Jake closed his eyes and saw cascading images that were simultaneously memory and prophecy, glimpses of his grandmother kneeling in that yellow kitchen, receiving her own visitation decades ago in the language of dreams and intuitions she'd called answered prayer, saw himself as a child lying in summer grass, watching clouds reshape themselves into messages he'd been too young to read, but old enough to sense mattered, saw the long chain of moments that had appeared random but were now revealed as curriculum. Each loss and disappointment and inexplicable survival teaching him something essential about surrender and trust that had prepared him for exactly this impossible night. "What you're giving me," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the ship's interior. "It's not just alien technology, is it? It's something that's been returning to Earth in different forms for as long as humans have been looking up at stars and wondering if we're alone. Something that prophets and mystics have tried to describe with the limited vocabulary available to them. Something Jesus himself carried and demonstrated and tried to show us we all have access to if we could just believe beyond the boundaries of what we've been taught is possible." The being's luminescence shifted into colors Jake had no names for, hues that seemed to exist in spectrums his eyes shouldn't have been able to register, but somehow could now, as if the device in his hands was already expanding his perceptual range, upgrading his capacity to receive what had always been broadcasting, but on frequencies he'd lacked the equipment to detect until this moment of divine recalibration. "You are beginning to understand," it communicated with a resonance that Jake felt in his teeth and fingertips, in the roots of his hair and the soles of his feet, as if his entire body was becoming an antenna for truths too large for his brain alone to process. "What we give you is both ancient and new, both familiar and strange, because it carries the signature of the one source from which all genuine healing and awakening flows, the consciousness your scriptures call Christ, but which exists beyond any single name or tradition, the light that was present at creation and has never stopped creating, never stopped calling scattered fragments of itself back into remembrance of their true nature and divine origin." Jake opened his eyes and looked directly at the being, finding he could now hold its gaze without feeling overwhelmed, as if something in him had strengthened or perhaps simply remembered its own magnitude, its own heritage as a child of the infinite, clothed temporarily in flesh and limitation, for purposes that were only now beginning to make sense. "My grandmother used to say that Jesus didn't come to start a religion, but to show us what a human looks like when they're fully awake to who they really are," Jake said, his voice steadier now, carrying a certainty that rose from depths he hadn't known he possessed. "And I think what you're telling me is that this awakening isn't finished, that it's been rippling outward since that moment 2,000 years ago, when divinity and humanity proved they were never actually separate, and that what's happening now across Earth, and maybe across countless other worlds, is that ripple finally reaching shores that have been waiting in darkness for the tide to turn." The being moved. closer, and Jake felt, rather than saw it, place something like a hand over his heart, over the place where the crystalline device rested, and warmth flooded through him with such intensity that for a moment he thought he might dissolve, might simply come apart into particles of light and joy and recognition, too powerful for his physical form to contain. But then the sensation stabilized, and he found himself still intact, but fundamentally altered, as if every cell had been retuned to a higher frequency, every atom reminded of its sacred function as a temporary gathering point for consciousness, learning to express love through limitation. You will return to your world carrying frequencies that will heal without you necessarily knowing you're healing, will speak words that land in hearts with precision beyond your conscious intention, will make choices that seem small but create ripples in the fabric of reality that affect outcomes you'll never personally witness, but that matter nonetheless in the great unfolding of divine purpose. To willing vessels who say yes before they fully understand what they're agreeing to, the communication carried weight that felt like ordination, like commissioning, like being set apart for holy use, while simultaneously being told that holiness had always been his nature, had always been every human's nature, just forgotten under layers of fear and false teaching and the desperate attempt to make ourselves small enough to fit into boxes that were never designed to contain the vastness of what we actually are. Jake felt tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from the peculiar ache of homecoming, the recognition of something so deeply true that the soul could only respond with weeping, with the kind of tears that wash away not just pain, but the illusion that pain was ever the final word, that darkness was ever more powerful than light, that any soul was ever truly lost beyond the reach of love's persistent searching. "I'll do it," Jake heard himself saying, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. Beyond a general yes to the mystery, a blanket consent to be used. However, the divine intelligence that had orchestrated this entire impossible encounter saw fit to use him. "I'll carry this back, and I'll let it work through me, and I'll trust that the same force that brought you here tonight will show me step by step how to translate what I've experienced into something that helps people remember what they've forgotten about themselves and about the God who's been trying to reach them through every sunrise and every stranger's kindness and every moment of beauty that breaks their heart open just enough to let eternity slip through." The being stepped back, and Jake understood the encounter was completing, that he was being released back into the world he'd left hours ago. Though he would never be able to inhabit it quite the same way again, would never be able to look at anything as purely mundane or anyone as merely human, would carry for the rest of his days this knowledge of the larger story, playing out through what appeared to be ordinary lives in unremarkable places where God was planting seeds of cosmic awakening in soil that looked like filling stations and grocery stores and hospital waiting rooms, where people sat with their private griefs, unaware they were being held in awareness that stretched across galaxies and dimensions. As he turned toward the opening that would return him to the desert night, Jake clutched the crystalline device and felt its promise pulsing against his palm, felt the compressed potential it carried, the healing frequencies and revelatory knowledge that would unfold across the remainder of his life in perfect synchronization with his capacity to receive and integrate and express them through the specific gifts and limitations of his particular incarnation. He paused at the threshold and looked back one final time at the being who had crashed into his world and shattered every assumption he'd constructed about the nature of reality. And in that moment of mutual recognition, he understood that he was looking not at something alien, but at family, at another expression of the same divine love that had somehow decided the best way to know itself was to scatter itself across infinite forms, and then spend eternity discovering itself anew in each encounter, each moment of genuine meeting between souls who were always and never strangers, always and never. Separate from the source that dreamed them into being and sustained them, with each breath they drew in bodies they'd temporarily forgotten, were temples housing the very presence of God. Jake drove back through the desert as dawn began its slow resurrection along the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber that seemed to him now like visual prayers, like the universe itself exhaling beauty as a form of worship. And he realized with a strange mixture of grief and joy that he could never again see a sunrise as merely atmospheric phenomenon, could never reduce it to molecules and physics without simultaneously perceiving it as the daily testimony of a creator who refused to let darkness have the final word, who kept returning light to a world that desperately needed reminding that night was never permanent, that every ending contained encoded within it the promise of beginning again. The crystalline device rested in his jacket pocket, warm against his ribs, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, as if it was teaching his body a new cadence, a new frequency of operation that would allow him to function as a bridge between the world he'd known and the vastly larger reality he'd just barely glimpsed through the doorway that alien encounter had opened in the fabric of what he'd previously accepted as the limits of possible experience. He thought of his grandmother, dead now 5 years, and wondered if she was somehow aware of what had happened to him tonight, if she was rejoicing in whatever dimension of existence her soul now occupied, celebrating that the seeds she'd planted in his childhood, with her quiet faith and her absolute certainty that God was far bigger and stranger and more loving than any doctrine could contain, had finally found soil deep enough to root in and break through the concrete of his skepticism and despair. As he pulled into the empty parking lot of his garage, Jake sat for a long moment in the truck, watching the familiar shapes of his ordinary life emerge from shadow into definition, as daylight claimed them, and he understood that everything he was looking at remained exactly the same while simultaneously being completely transformed, that the sacred task ahead of him was learning to inhabit this doubled vision, this capacity to see both the surface of things and the luminous depth underlying every surface, the divine presence that saturated every atom of creation, waiting patiently to be recognized and celebrated and consciously collaborated with by humans who'd been given the strange gift of free will, the dangerous freedom to see or not see, to participate or refuse participation in the grand adventure of matter, becoming conscious of its own divine origin. The months that followed were simultaneously the most difficult and most purposeful Jake had ever experienced, as he discovered that carrying cosmic knowledge while pumping gas and rotating tires required a kind of integration that nobody had prepared him for, a constant practice of translating revelation into practical service, of allowing the extraordinary to express itself through the humble, repetitive actions of showing up and being present, and treating each customer not as an interruption, but as a divine appointment, each interaction as an opportunity to transmit something he couldn't name, but could feel moving through him whenever he operated from the centered space, the crystalline device had opened in his awareness. People started noticing something different about him, though they couldn't articulate what had changed, only that being in his presence left them feeling somehow lighter, more hopeful, as if Jake carried an atmosphere around him that reminded their souls of something they'd forgotten, some essential truth about their own worth and belovedness that the world's harsh judgments had buried under years of accumulated shame and disappointment, and the grinding exhaustion of just trying to survive in systems that seemed designed to extract rather than nourish human flourishing. Jake began staying late at the garage, not to catch up on work, but to be available. When certain people would arrive, seemingly by accident but actually by divine orchestration, people who were on the edge of giving up or making terrible choices, born from desperation, and he'd find himself saying things he didn't consciously plan, offering perspectives that surprised him even as they left his mouth, as if he was being spoken through by an intelligence that knew exactly what each specific soul needed to hear in that precise moment to take the next step toward healing, toward hope, toward remembering they weren't random accidents in an indifferent universe, but beloved children of a God who'd literally crashed through dimensions to remind humanity of their cosmic heritage and sacred destiny. He started a small gathering in the garage on Sunday evenings, not a church exactly, but a space where people could come and share what they were going through and experience being truly seen and heard without judgment, where Jake would sometimes place his hand on someone's shoulder and feel the warmth from the device flow through him into them, watch their faces shift as something inside them relaxed or released or realigned, as if his touch carried a frequency that reminded their bodies of the healing template they'd been created from, the divine blueprint that existed prior to all wounding and remained intact beneath every layer of damage, waiting to be reactivated by love's patient attention. On a particularly cold evening in November, Jake stood outside the garage, looking up at the stars, feeling the device pulse against his chest like a second heart. And he understood finally that this was what heaven's invasion of Earth actually looked like, not armies of angels announcing themselves with trumpets and fanfare, but quiet shifts in consciousness happening in mechanics and nurses and teachers and grocery clerks. Ordinary people waking up to their extraordinary nature and choosing to let that awakening overflow into their daily interactions, transforming the world not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated impact of thousands of small moments when someone chose love over fear, chose presence over distraction, chose to see the divine image in the difficult customer and the annoying neighbor and the scared teenager who'd just wrecked their first car and was terrified to call their parents. He thought about the being on that ship, wondered where it was now in its journey across the cosmos, carrying its mission of preserving life and awakening dormant consciousness on planets scattered across distances his mind couldn't even conceptualize. And he sent a wordless prayer of gratitude into the night. A thank you that encompassed not just that one encounter, but the entire mysterious curriculum of his life. Every failure that had taught him humility, every loss that had cracked his heart open wide enough to let compassion in, every moment of desperation that had finally exhausted his illusion of control and forced him to surrender to a guidance far wiser than his own anxious planning could ever produce. Jake smiled as he felt the familiar warmth spread through his chest, felt the device respond to his gratitude with an intensification of its gentle pulsing, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, that his purpose had never been to escape Earth for the stars, but to bring the stars' ancient wisdom down into the dirt and grease and beauty of this particular planet, this blue jewel spinning through darkness, carrying its cargo of struggling, magnificent, utterly beloved souls who were all, whether they knew it yet or not, on their way home to the God who'd never stopped calling them back to remembrance of who they'd always been beneath the forgetting. The garage became known throughout the county as a place where miracles happened, though Jake would never use that word, would only say that people got what they needed when they were ready to receive it, that he was just a mechanic who'd learned to pay attention to the deeper repairs every human required beneath the surface problems they brought. To his door, the wounded belief systems and traumatic disconnections and soul-deep loneliness that no amount of material success could ever address, only the medicine of genuine presence and unconditional acceptance and the radical reminder that they were seen and known and treasured by a love that had authored galaxies but still numbered every hair on their head and collected every tear they'd cried in the middle of nights when they thought no one was watching or caring about their private anguish. Jake trained himself to listen beneath the words people spoke, to hear the questions they were really asking under the surface, complaints about transmission problems and brake noises. And he'd find ways to address both levels simultaneously, fixing their vehicles while planting seeds in their consciousness, offering observations that seemed casual but landed with precision in the exact places their souls were hungry for nourishment and validation. He watched his town slowly transform as the people he touched went out and touched others, as the frequencies he carried began spreading through the community like benevolent contagion, like a divine virus that infected people with hope and kindness, and a renewed sense that their lives mattered, that they were part of a story much larger and more beautiful than they'd been taught to believe, was available to ordinary people in unremarkable places where nothing important was supposed to happen, but where, Jake now understood, everything important was always happening, where God was constantly staging encounters between souls who carried exactly what each other needed for the next stage of their awakening, orchestrating synchronicities that looked like coincidence but were actually love's intricate choreography playing out through willing participants who'd said yes to being used as instruments of grace in a world that was far more responsive to prayer and intention than its material surface suggested, a world that was even now being rewoven from the inside out by humans who were finally remembering they weren't just citizens of Earth but ambassadors of heaven, not just products of evolution, but expressions of eternal consciousness, learning what it meant to be divine while wearing flesh, to be infinite while inhabiting limitation, to carry the presence of God in vessels made from dust and starlight, and the wild hope that love was, and always had been, the deepest truth underlying all of creation's apparent chaos and suffering and mysterious beauty. What moment in your life felt like a divine appointment you didn't recognize until later? If this story touched your soul, please subscribe to continue receiving messages of hope and awakening.